when we talk about the human figure, we talk about the fact that the basic form of the human figure is constructed with spheres, cylinders, and ovoids. That we have the object itself, we have the light coming in from an angle, therefore we have what's called the highlight, the body of light, which is this zone here where the light is hitting. Then we have the break of shadow. The entire right side of that form, that ovoid, is what we call the shadow side of the object. And then we have some transition tones, like the reflected light space right in here, the transition from light to dark where it blends, and some of the tones around the edges, what we call turning edges. So we've drawn the contour of the ovoid, and the first thing we're going to want to do is we're going to find that point of highlight and where that exists. We could demarcate it a little there, and then we're going to find what's called the break of the shadow. And that break of the shadow is going to encompass a certain proportion of the object. And so what you're trying to do when you're drawing with light and shadow is you're trying to think about how large the shadow shape is in relation to the shape of light on the object. The distance from the edge of the object to the highlight, and let's just label that A, okay? And then from the center of the object to its break of shadow along that axis, we'll label that one B. The distance between A and B are always going to be the same. Let's draw a second ovoid over here. And instead, let's put the highlight closer to the center of the object. Let's draw the axis of the object right through the center. Now what we have is a line that goes through the exact center of the ovoid, and we're going to draw the axis like this. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this distance here, and I'm going to repeat it here. And I'm going to be able to do that around the whole form. And what we'll find is that the break of shadow in this case would be much further to the right, and there would be much less of the shadow visible because of the relationship of where the light source is in relation to the object. So the key to this is that there's a certain geometry to light and shadow that we need to be mindful of when we're looking at how light and shadow fall on any round form, including an ovoid. Let's consider, for instance, a different form like a cylinder. Okay, so there's our cylinder. What I want to show you is that if we could see through the cylinder, we would see a dotted line like this for the bottom of the cylinder. And I could find the center of that ellipse, and I could find the center of this ellipse, and I could connect these two with what we call the axis of the cylinder. If I'm at the center of my object, and I draw any angle radiating from the center of the object away, I could draw an angle that relates to what we call the angle of lighting. Let me draw an angle like this, and I'll just keep going out of the cylinder like that. And what I'll do is I'll put an arrow on it like this to indicate that that's the angle of my lighting as it's coming in to hit this object. And you can see the first place it hits at the bottom of the object is right here. On a cylinder, that would indicate the point that the highlight would exist, because the highlight is always going to be the place on the object that's closest to the center of the light source. So in this case, if we have a light bulb over here and it's shining in like this, that light would be most intense because at this point of the cylinder, because that point of the cylinder is technically the closest point on the cylinder to the light source. For example, let's look at it from a bird's eye view. Looking down at the cylinder, what would we see? We'd see a circle. Looking down at it, we'd see a dot for the axis, and the angle of light would come off of that like this, and our light source would be over here, shining like this. And what we would notice is that, yes, this point on the object right there, X marks the spot, that spot would be the belly of the object that is closest to the light source. In other words, if I put a beam of light over here, this is a little further away. If I put a beam of light over here and it hits here, this is actually further away than this. The further the light has to travel, the less intense it is. And so the highlight, back to our cylinder, would run up the side of the cylinder from this point to the top, and we could actually draw a second angle like this, again, through the center of the object, and that would indicate what we'd call the angle of our lighting coming towards that cylinder. If the light is coming from this direction and meeting the cylinder like this, these beams of light are doing this along the same way. Remember, light is parallel. Beams of light are parallel. And so there's going to be a place right here where that parallel ray comes along, and it doesn't hit the object, it just misses the object and goes past it. And if we look at where that is going to be right here. And so this would be the place on the object that is the last place light is going to hit. Light can't hit anything to the right of this because that's the part of the object that starts to curve away from the light source. And so again, our break of shadow would start there, and our break of shadow would come up like this and occupy the whole entire right side of the object. So we can draw a line from this point through the center of the object, and notice where it's going to land. It's going to land right at the highlight on the opposite side. If I was to come up this side of the object, I would end up here, and I could then put a perfectly straight line through the center of the object at the top section, and I would end up back at this point. In other words, if I connect these dots, I end up taking my cylinder and I can chop it right in half like I took a knife and cut it right down the middle. What that indicates is that half of my object is captured in shadow and half of my object is in light. But let's look at, again, the measurements of that, because it's very, very cool, and we can see it happening here. This angle between highlight and where the shadow break is, that angle is a 90-degree angle. It's the same on the other side. And the distance from the contour of the object to the highlight is the same as the distance from the middle of the object to the break of the shadow. Let's take it one step further with a cylinder. We're going to draw another cylinder, and what we're going to do is we're going to put, again, the center dot here. We'll find the bottom ellipse and we'll put a center dot there, and we'll draw the axis of the cylinder. And I'm going to use this angle now, like I did over here, the angle of the, what we call shadow break. And instead, I'm going to make that the angle of my lighting. So what will happen? The light comes in from here. The light comes in from there on this side. We have our light plane. The highlight would be behind the object. We can't see it. But the break of the shadow would be, as we said, 90 degrees in relation to the light source. So the break of shadow line will go from here, because as you can see, if we follow these beams along like this, the last place those light beams hit is right there along that object. That's where they start to miss. And so right from here up, this would be our shadow break. And our shadow would occupy this whole back side of the object, which means that all of this would be glazed in shadow. What do we end up with? We end up with a little sliver of light on the object, and we end up with the majority of the object cast in shadow. The geometry is still the same. When we looked at our ovoid, that was the ostrich egg, I have my light source coming in from the front and off to the side. And so I have a situation where if I literally divide this object up into parts, like this, across the middle, I can figure out that, in fact, 3/4 of the object is light and 1/4 is shadow. And so there we go. We've blocked in our light. These are some of the names. I'm going to give this whole zone here is called the body of light. The body of light is the shape of light on the object. This other part here we call the body of shadow. You can also call it the light side and the dark side of the object. But we noticed that there were some darker points and some lighter points than these bodies. So the body of light is light, but it's not the lightest part of light. The lightest part is the highlight right where we pointed it. So I'll use my eraser and I'll brighten that up and try to make it a little brighter than everything else. So we have our body of light and we have our body of shadow, and we have this thing, and this thing is what we'll refer to as the highlight. Then we have an area in the shadow space that's the darkest space of the shadow, and it's actually the area that runs just to the shadow side of the break of shadow. It's not all the way to the far edge where we might think it is. If I were just being asked, sometimes I ask this question of my students, I say, where is the darkest part of the object? And if somebody has never studied this, they'll say, oh, it's the farthest away from the light, because that makes the most common sense. But it actually isn't the farthest part from the object where the light is. It's actually in the middle. And that's because it's the place that's the least likely to be hit by any light that bounces around. We'll come back to our cylinders. Do you remember when I said some of the light is going to miss the cylinder from our lamp? Well, where is it going to go? It's not going to just go into outer space. It's going to go into some other part of the room that we're in, and it's going to bounce off of things. So if there's something over here, that light beam could go over, it could bounce off of it and reflect back. And if it reflects back, it's going to illuminate some of the shadow side of that cylinder, and it's going to illuminate the back shadow side of that cylinder. On the ovoid, it makes this far, far right area lighter than the rest of the shadow. We call this the reflected light. So there's two names now we're going to learn. The first is the darker thing, and the darker thing is called the core of the shadow. The lighter space within shadow is called the reflected light. Finally, you're going to notice if you look at any object with light on it that the places along the edges of light and the edges in the shadow space, really the contours of the object are more or less what we talk about. They get a little bit darker than everything else. There's just a slight darkening around those edges. And those are what we call the turning edges. Now you want to be very subtle with the turning edges. And so now we have our body of light, our body of shadow, our highlight, our core of the shadow, our reflected light, and our turning edges. And the final turning edge is what's called the transition edge. And that's the transition from dark to light. It's never going to be really sharp unless it's on an angular object, but it would be this zone right through the middle here, and that's what's called the transition. Or midtones is another term. And what we're going to do is take some tone and we'll just kind of tickle it in here along that transition. So I'm going to work on the right side of my sketchbook, and I'm just going to talk to you about quickly the order in which you should do these things. So number one, always draw your contour of your form. And that's the first step of anything. So we drew the oval shape of the ovoid. Second, we want to always delineate or separate light and shadow with a line. And in that case, we draw that arc that works through separating light and shadow. Number 3, we're going to block in our shadow, which is going to give us the body of light, and it's going to give us the body of shadow. Then we are going to want to start to bring out the 3 nuanced shapes. And they don't have to happen in any order, but this is the order I like to go in. So 4, I like to add the core of the shadow, because after all, drawing is kind of an additive process. And what that's going to give me, so I'll say 4A, is it's going to give me the reflected light. And the term I like to use is that the reflected light is revealed. So by adding the core of the shadow, the reflected light is revealed. Then we're going to add tone, and this is where you need to be subtle, for the body of light. And just like that, 5A, the highlight is revealed. And finally, the last step would be to work the most subtle work, and that's going to be your turning edges and your midtones.